So thanks for those kind words, Dwight, and thanks, Josh, for for organizing all of this. Yeah, so Bay Road has been sort of a fascination of mine, and as Dwight eloquently described, it's been sort of an ongoing project. Not anything that's had a start date or an end date. I'm still continuing to gather a lot of information about Bay Road, but I'm happy to share with you the information that I've gleaned so far. So we're going to talk not just about the history of Bay Road, but we're going to talk, what's really more meaningful, in my opinion, is what Bay Road's role has been in our history, not just in our towns, but in our society, in our community, and really in our nation. So that's the plan. A little bit of background about me. I have no professional credentials as a historian. I really took this on sort of as the beginning of a pandemic project. You're kind of cooped up and you're, thinking about, what to do with your time. And I have been a resident of Bay Road since going on 40 years now. I built my house here on Bay Road and have never moved. It's just such a beautiful place. As has already been mentioned, I'm a member of the both historical societies because I do have a foot in both camps. I do pay Sharon taxes, unfortunately, which are higher than Stoughton taxes, but it's all good. And driving up and down, Bay Road for the last several decades, I've always had the curiosity about the buildings, the mile markers, the cemeteries, all of the structures, and it's got me to scratch my head about what's really going on here in on this Bay Road. And so I went to my one of my mentors, Shirley Schofield, who was a longtime resident of Sharon and has had many offices in Bay Road, many offices in the Sharon Historical Society. I said, Shirley, somebody should do a presentation about the history of Bay Road because there's got to be something there. And so she said, well, Joe, why don't you do it? So anyway, so if you like this presentation, Shirley gets the credit. If you don't like this presentation, it's Shirley's fault. So the takeaway on this is that I'm really sort of like the accidental tourist. I'm the accidental historian. So what I've learned is that Bay Road has had many names over the years, and you could see them listed there. There's at least 6 on the screen, but there's many beyond that. These are probably the 6 most common. So history and legend suggested Bay Road connects Massachusetts Bay and Boston with a bay to the south, the southeast, or the southwest. So there's differing opinions, but it makes sense because there's no bays in Sharon or Stoughton or Easton or the surrounding towns. So it's got to come from somewhere. So what does this road connect? So I like to start with a pop quiz for the audience. And you guys decide, what do you think? Does Bay Road connect Massachusetts Bay in Boston to either Narragansett Bay, Cape Cod Bay, or Buzzards Bay? And you can just answer to yourself. There's no, obviously we can't shout it out. So just what do you think? Does it connect to any one of these? Because a lot of people have strong opinions about where the Massachusetts Bay connects. So that was my sort of kind of motivation. So that's where I started my research. So let's learn where the research takes us. And early records indicate that we know that the Wampanoags really started this path, and they started it long before the colonists arrived. So it's perhaps thousands of years old. In fact, the Wampanoags, they would use their calendar by the moon. So they every year would have 13 months because, there's 13 lunar cycles in the year. And so they would have 13 moons per year, and they would go back between 10 and 15,000 years. So, they're the originators of this Bay Road. Without some, modest hyperbole, this could be among the oldest roads in North America. And the early reports show that the trail was probably about 2 or 3 feet wide and maybe a foot deep, and it followed the grain of the terrain. So the Wampanoags were smart, and they were gonna avoid marshes, and they were gonna avoid hills. So that's how Bay Road kind of got its meandering, sort of country road sort of kind of description. So it's not straight as a laser beam because it started out really as a footpath. So the first records from the colonists date back to 1621, and the reason for that is because the Mayflower that brought the Pilgrims, as we know from 1620, well, their sentinel event was on April 5th, 1621, is when the Mayflower left Plymouth and went back to England. And so when the Mayflower left in April 5th, 1621, that was a yikes for the Pilgrims that already were decimated by the first winter. And so Edward Winslow and Stephen Hopkins were sent by Captain Miles Standish, who was the military leader in charge of the defense of the Plymouth colony. And he dispatched these two guys with their posse to secure a treaty with Massasoit. And they brought with them a gift of a red cloak because they were going to pay homage to Massasoit and incur his confidence. They were also looking to conduct a recon of the strength and the terrain of the Wampanoags. So they did that, and in the process of doing that, they came across this nice flat land against the Taunton, well, what's now called the Taunton River, and Massasoit was on the other side of the Taunton River in the Mount Hope Reservoir area on the Rhode Island border. So in the process of doing that, they found this area, which is now called Taunton, now became Taunton, and that became a settlement in 1638, and Taunton then became a town in 1639. And in the process of doing that, they were going from west to east, east to west, but in the process of going west, they saw this path that the Native Americans had identified that brought them up to the Massachusetts colony, or to the Shawmut tribe in the north, and they found this pathway, and they said, well, what's up there? And so that was the original Bay Road. So that's documented back to from the colonists, from Winslow and Hopkins, that they found this north-south pathway that went up to another bay. And then so that from that Taunton to Boston Bay Road is really the original Bay Road, and that's 36 miles long. So I took the liberty of finding that original path that starts, in Massachusetts, or starts in Boston, and it's and you could see it here. And so it starts, and here's a pretty cool thing that I've done with it. So I've highlighted it with my Google Maps and my overlay. So I'm pretty proud of this. So I'm going to give it to you a couple of times. So it shows you how it passes through the various towns. So it starts literally at the Boston Common, Washington Street, and you can see there's sort of an Adams Street loop, where that it, is right up around here. And then it goes into Blue Hill Ave in Dorchester. Then when it gets into Milton, it becomes Canton Ave, Route 138, under Route 128, and then 95 South. And then from Canton, it goes to Washington Street through Canton, through Canton Center to Cobb's Corner. We're all familiar with, the Cobb's Corner intersection. And then it becomes the border between Sharon and Stoughton. So Bay Road is the town boundary between Sharon and Stoughton, and then it continues on into Easton. Now, Easton has actually the most original section down here. My cursor covers down here. And in fact, as you see with Canton, is up here, and then in Sharon and Stoughton, it's actually the town line. But in Easton, it actually bisects the town. So as we'll learn, Easton has probably the most original section. And in fact, part of the Bay Road in Easton is on the National Register. And it actually, bisects Easton in the center. So there's a lot more things that have been happening historically that were in Easton than in pretty much almost every other town. We'll get into that as well. And then in Norton, it passes through probably the two largest major bodies of water, Lake Winnacunnet and Watson Pond State Park. And then we get into Taunton, as we've already talked about. And here's where it becomes the waypoint to alternate extensions. So that's pretty irrefutable. That's the original Bay Road. And each of these towns have a part of Bay Road. And as kind of, Josh and Dwight have mentioned, I looked into each of these towns, and it was interesting. The revelation to me was each of these towns have their, everybody's proud of their town and they want to, celebrate, their contributions to history. But there's only a handful of people that actually have connected the dots and looked at it, in its totality. So I tried to string together all of these dots and try to, learn from each of the towns. And as a sort of a quid pro quo, as a payback, I went to many of these towns and shared with them my findings. So here's where it gets interesting. Once you get into Taunton, for those of you that said Bay Road goes to Narragansett Bay, well, there's evidence to support that. And again, here we see the original Bay Road here, but then once we get to Taunton, so here's the original Bay Road coming down through all the various towns. Oh, and by the way, just to mention this, you see this line, you'll see this on all these Massachusetts maps. All of the counties kind of have jagged lines, but when you see a line as straight as an arrow like this, that was the original dividing line between the Massachusetts colony and the Plymouth colony. So this line still exists today. Now it makes up various town borders, but that was the original, going back to the early 17th century. Okay, so we get to Taunton here, and we see these Bay Road extensions. And where do they go? Well, they go down to Narragansett Bay, as we can see. Here's Narragansett Bay. So those of you that said Bay Road goes Massachusetts Bay to Narragansett Bay, you're correct. Now, the people that say Bay Road goes to Cape Cod Bay, well, we know that it sort of does because of Winslow and Hopkins, and this shows us the same route. So here we have the Adams Loop up here. Get my cursor over here. So here's the Adams Loop in Dorchester, and then it can take an alternate pathway down into into Plymouth. And the Winslow Hopkins was more of a horizontal east-west. And then the third option is Bay Road to Buzzards Bay. And we do have evidence of that as well. So this map shows with the arrow, with the, looking at the sort of olive drab color, we have Boston going through Taunton, as we know, and then heading into New Bedford into Buzzards Bay. And then here's the Narragansett Bay. And of course, here's the Cape Cod Bay. So we do have evidence to suggest that Bay Road, without a doubt, goes Boston to Taunton, and it does go into three different alternative directions as a result after that. So whether you said any of the three, you're all correct. So a little bit, now that you have a little bit of background of this north-south main thoroughfare, let's peel the onion back a little bit and see some of the notable events and the famous travelers that have journeyed along this important road. So going back originally, to the people that were here first, we remember Massasoit. He was the chief Sachem, the leader of the Wampanoag Confederacy. He had 5 children. Wamsuta, whose English name was Alexander, Pometicom or Metacom, whose English name was Philip, and then he had 3 daughters as well. We know Metacom because of King Philip's War, and he'll play a big role as we get into this in the next few slides. And when in doing my research, the Easton people will tell me that King Philip or Metacom was born at Mulberry Brook by a fishing weir, which is at off of Highland Avenue in Easton. Not the Highland Avenue that we see off of Bay Road in the Sharon Stoughton side, not that Highland Avenue, but if you journey farther south and you cross 106 and you go into Easton, then there, and you go down to the traffic light, and there's a right-hand turn. That's the Highland Ave that I'm talking about. And that Highland Ave in Easton, if you go down there, not more than merely a football field away, you'll find Mulberry Brook, and there's a fishing weir, and that's how the Native Americans got their. They didn't fish with a a hook, line, and sinker. They didn't fish with a fishing pole. They constructed sort of a circular configuration to try to trap fish as they were moving up or downstream. And that's where they allege that the Eastern historical people will tell me that when they were digging around the cemetery there, they found that some of the Wampanoags came up and wanted to be present because they said that that's where King Philip was born. Now that's oral history from a Wampanoag to the Eastern Historical Society. So I'll just leave that there with you for as much credibility as you would like to assign. King Philip's Cave is in Norton, further down that Bay Road, and King Philip's Cave is off of Plain Street. So if you follow Bay Road a little farther south, you'll see King Philip's Cave. And here's a picture of Massasoit that was in our is in Plymouth Harbor. Here's King Philip's Cave. So if you follow down Bay Road and you walk and you take a right-hand turn onto Plain, literally right, again, no more than a few hundred yards off of Plain, you'll find this entrance to King Philip's Cave. And this is what you see as you walk up to King Philip's Cave. So it looks like a cave, but then when you get a little more closer to it, you see that it's in fact more of a tunnel. And then as you duck your head and walk through it, you'll be on the other side. And the other side of this area to me looks like this is where Metacom sort of hung out. And there's, the story is that he hid here during King Philip's War so that he wouldn't be captured. And this area down here might have been, on the other side. This is sort of like their cooking area, their living area, and then they would move inside the cave here for shelter. So that's King Philip's Cave, literally right, around the corner, right off of Bay Road. Okay, moving further up the chronological timeline, we have Roger Williams and Ann Hutchinson and their story of how they traveled down Bay Road. Just to refresh your memory that Roger Williams was an early proponent for the separation of church and state. He was a man that believed in free thinking, free speech, freedom of religion, which was not the Puritan way. So he was an anathema to the Puritans. In fact, he opposed taking land from the Native Americans, where otherwise the Puritan way was just to plant their flag and say, "I declare this land in the name of King George," and they would just take it. So he was a bit more progressive and liberal, and so he offered to purchase the land from the Native Americans, which of course was also kind of flawed because the Native Americans had no concept of purchasing land because they were the land and the land was them, and it was the same thing. So because of Roger Williams's sort of fringe policies, he was found guilty by the Puritans of these new and dangerous opinions and of espousing Satan's policy. So his days were numbered, and he was, he decided to get out while the getting was good. So he traveled down our Bay Road and found refuge with the Narragansetts in Rhode Island. He did not try to convert them to Christianity. In fact, he offered to purchase land from them. He bought the land from them, and he named that land Providence in thanksgiving to God. And he conducted a kind of a social experiment where he opened up his colony to anyone that wanted to join, regardless of their beliefs or their religions. So guess what? He even opened up his colony to Quakers and Jews, which was like unheard of. This is like radical. He was also a man that believed in Sir Edward Coke's position of who created the term "a man's home is his castle." And the Puritan way was you couldn't, the Puritan way decided your government, and his way was that no, I could say whatever I want, I could think whatever I want, and certainly I should be able to do that in my own home. And that was a big departure. And then Ann Hutchinson, she followed him a few years later, and she founded Portsmouth, Rhode Island, and brought the same concepts and the same progressive and policies towards that. Okay, moving up the calendar a little bit, let's talk about George Washington. So we all remember that George Washington, was the leader of our country, and the general in the Revolutionary War and our first president, et cetera. And the benchmarks here are April 19th, which we know as Patriots' Day. That was the Battle of Lexington and Concord, where the shot heard around the world and the revolution started and everything began. And then in June 17th, just a couple months later, the Battle of Bunker Hill occurred, where the colonists lost, but it was sort of a Pyrrhic victory for the Redcoats. So after that, actually on June 15th, George Washington traveled to Philadelphia. So he was in Philadelphia, where the Continental Congress was meeting, and he had to move to Boston, which is a 400-mile trip. And he was now placed in charge of this newly formed Continental Army. So how did he go? The people in Easton will tell you that he came through Bay Road. So on June 23rd is when he left. It's well documented. It took him 9 days. He went through 50 towns. Many well-wishers and supporters turned out. He rallied a lot of militia along the way. So did he travel up Bay Road? Did he go from Taunton to Sharon, into Canton, into Milton, and into Dorchester? There are people that believe it's true. I really don't think so. And I think there's more evidence to show that he took an upper post road, as we'll see here. We've identified our Bay Road coming down here, and this is the upper post road, and this is the lower post road. And so if you're George Washington, you're coming from Philadelphia up through New York City, you're gonna be on the other side of the river. You're going to be on the other side of the Charles River. So why would you want to have to cross the Charles River? So it would make sense that you would go in from the west and you would come in that way. So the reason that makes more sense, and the reason that is actually supported by the evidence, is that Washington didn't travel alone, and he traveled with his command staff and with a lot of soldiers. And there are publicans, there are innkeepers that have receipts for George Washington's party that actually stayed at those locations and actually drank his ale and his rum. So for those reasons, we're going with the fact that Washington took the upper post road and not the Bay Road, unfortunately. So we have to take umbrage with the Eastern people on that one. But there's lots of other luminaries. Benjamin Franklin was a big deal. We all know Benjamin Franklin was the first postmaster general of the American colonies, and he surveyed Bay Road originally back in 1754, and really wanted to widen it, and he widened it to as much as 40 feet in Easton. Now it's really only 30 feet wide now, so this was the beginning of the first super dirt highway that traveled north south, from Rhode Island, from Taunton, straight north into the Massachusetts colony. Ben Franklin, but the evidence that we have that he definitely traveled Bay Road was that he traveled from Boston to Philadelphia for the Second Continental Congress, and he traveled from Boston down Bay Road to the Taunton Green, and he visited at the home of Robert Treat Paine, because we know that his wife Sally wrote in her diary that Dr. Franklin stayed with her, because she asked Dr. Franklin to deliver a letter to her husband, Robert Treat Paine, who was a member of the Continental Congress, to please don't forget about your poor wife who's managing this farm, the children, the animals, and all of the crops, all by herself. And it'd be nice for you to drop a note or send some support or just show up once in a while. So it was a little bit of a, kind of a pointed letter. And so that letter still lives, and Dr. Franklin delivered it. Robert Treat Paine, just to sort of put him in historical context, he was the son of Thomas Paine. We remember Thomas Paine because Thomas Paine wrote the pamphlets Common Sense that really were the sort of some of the instigating documents to, really called for independence. So those were sort of inciting documents to say we should separate ourselves from the crown. And those Common Sense pamphlets really were written by his dad, Thomas Paine. Robert Treat Paine's other sort of historical footnote was that remember during the Boston Massacre, where the Redcoats fired on on the colonists right outside the old State House, because someone was throwing snowballs at the colonists, and I mean at the Redcoats, and the Redcoats opened fire. Were they provoked or were they not provoked? We're not sure. They went to trial, and Robert Treat Paine defended the colonists. And guess who defended the Redcoats? Well, it was John Adams. John Adams defended the Redcoats, and John Adams was much better prepared. John Adams actually knew the law forwards and backwards. Robert Treat Paine thought it was going to be sort of a slam dunk, didn't have to prepare. Who's going to convict, what jury's going to convict the colonists? Well, John Adams actually got the Redcoats off. So that was a very interesting historical trial. So Robert Treat Paine is that guy. Okay, this is a painting of the Taunton Green that hangs in the Old Colony History Museum in Taunton, and this shows the Taunton Green, and this shows Robert Treat Paine and Sally's house. And so this is where Benjamin Franklin stayed, and there's plenty of evidence to support that. Okay, another luminary I'd like to mention is Marquis de Lafayette. So he fought at the Battle of Monmouth in New Jersey with George Washington. George Washington dispatched him to Rhode Island in an effort to help with the Rhode Island colonists to expel the British. The reason Washington dispatched Lafayette was that Fleet Admiral Comte d'Estaing, was a fellow Frenchman, and the Rhode Island colonists, were a little leery that the French's commitment was not going to be deep, was not going to be long-standing. And sure enough, as soon as Lafayette gets to the Rhode Island colony, Comte d'Estaing's was gone. And so the colonists were worried. They felt abandoned. They felt like, oh my God, the British are going to come and overrun us, and we don't have anybody to help defend. So Lafayette, on August 28th, 1778, and again, there's nice documentation to this, that he raced to Boston from Portsmouth, Rhode Island, the same path that Anne Hutchinson took. He raced through Taunton and headed up to Boston. And it took him, he traveled that 70 miles from Portsmouth Road to Rhode Island, up into Taunton, and then that 36 miles into Boston. He did that entire route in 6 hours. Got there, met up with the Admiral and said, Admiral, you must come back. And he says, relax. I'm just up here to get my ships refitted and repaired and all that. We'll be back. I'm just, I just need to get there, get some maintenance done. We'll be back. And he says, okay, good, thanks. And then he returns back to Portsmouth, Rhode Island in 5.5 hours to calm the Rhode Island citizenry to say, don't worry, he's coming back. Now, we know this because, you can't do that on one horse. So he had to change horses at regular intervals, and he changed horses at various inns and pubs and taverns along the way, and stables in order to change horses. So there's evidence that shows that our friend Lafayette, in his effort to defend the Rhode Island colony, went up and down Bay Road. Okay, again, moving the calendar a little forward, Paul Revere and Deborah Sampson. So Paul Revere, I'm not going to talk to you about his efforts during the Revolution or his Midnight Ride and all that, because that's well known. But as a retiring citizen post-Revolution, Paul Revere established a copper rolling mill on the Ponset River in 1801. And that is, is currently the Ponset Street, which is just off of Washington Street. And Washington Street, as we saw in our earlier map, Washington Street was the old Bay Road. And the town of Canton named it Washington Street in 1840 as a tribute to President Washington. But it was our Bay Road, and it's right near Canton Center. So Paul Revere established his copper rolling mill there. Deborah Sampson lived at the Zebulon Waterhouse on Bay Road, which we'll see shortly. And we remember Deborah Sampson as the woman who was such a strong patriot that she wanted to find a way to serve, that she disguised herself as a man and fought in the Revolutionary War. Her gender was revealed when she was wounded, but she was honorably discharged from the war. She was living at the Zebulon Waters house with her aunt. That's where she met her future husband, Benjamin Gannett. And then after they were both veterans and retired, so Deborah Sampson petitioned Paul Revere for help. Paul Revere went to the Congress and said, "Listen, you got to take care of this lady. She did everything that anybody else would do. The only reason she got had to stop serving is that she was wounded." And then she was honorably discharged. So Deborah Sampson was awarded back pay, applied for a pension, and with the help of Paul Revere, it was successfully granted. So where did they meet to do this? So Revere and Sampson met several times at Cobb's Tavern, where he gave to her assistance and actually where he delivered her pension. And I'm sure they had a cup of good cheer while they were in the tavern as well. Okay, so switching from some of the historical individuals to some of the historical locations, we'll shift gears here and maybe pick up the pace a little bit. And now we're going to be starting from the north and heading south. So starting in Canton, the Canton part of Bay Road, which is now Washington Street. So Samuel May opened up a shop there. Nathaniel May, which was his brother, hosted meetings there, and it was a place for the Minutemen that when they were on their call to Lexington, they rallied there on April 19th of 1775. They were able to find lodging there. The world famous Stoughton Musical Society had many performances there. And after the war, if you were a Tory, and a Tory was you were a sort of a British sympathizer, Tory trials were conducted in that location as well. It's right on the corner of Pleasant Street and Washington Street. This is the current structure that's there. This current structure was built in 1840. The original structure was torn down because it just got worn out. Everybody remembers Cobb's Tavern, or knows of Cobb's Tavern, because it's it's right there at Cobb's Corner at the intersection of the towns of Sharon, Stoughton, and Canton. That goes back to 1740. The original owner was Elijah Fisher. Jonathan Cobb purchased the property in 1797. He enlarged it considerably because he had 10 children, and they were born over the course of 20 years. So 10 children in 20 years, that's a busy family. So we had to make it bigger. In 1819, Jonathan Cobb was appointed postmaster, as well as because the tavern was sort of equidistant between Boston and Taunton. So it was a good place on the stage line to exchange passengers and to transfer mail. Warren Cobb, the son, took over the postmaster job in 1841 and in what was then called East Sharon. And then in 1895, Warren Cobb closed the post office, gave the home to his two daughters. It remained in the Cobb family until 1935. It was passed on to others, to include Chandler Jones, and there was a famous tap room that's 15 feet long, had a dark unpainted bar, a money slot on the end. Here's a photo. Earliest photo that I could find is 1890 of the original Cobb's Tavern. And here's a picture of the tavern itself. And here's that bar. I can't show you the money slot at the end. And here's a picture of Cobb's Tavern today. So it's still it still retains many of its features. This section over here is actually the tavern part, that I showed you the insides of before. Or private property, and it's not open for tours, but it's certainly a notable location. Moving farther south, on the Stoughton side of Bay Road, we have the William Drake House. Again, you drive by this many times without even appreciating it, and you can just sort of make out where I'm pointing here, the historical marker that denotes the William Drake House that goes back to 1775. Here's the James Smith House that dates back, and there's a little marker right here to 1794. This is the corner of Bay and Plain, and here's the Dry Pond Cemetery over on this side. And this house looks deceivingly small on the Bay Road side, but if you take a turn here and go down Plain, you'll see that this house is quite expansive and goes back probably twice or maybe 2.5 times its length versus its width. Again, moving south, but not too far down, this is directly across from the Dry Pond Cemetery, is the Archibald Drake House. And this was 1738, and this is built in 1401, built in 1738, and it's at 1401 Bay Road in Sharon. Again, looks deceivingly small, but it does go back quite a ways. This was recently, within the past year, was sold and purchased, and there's been an extension that's been added on, and literally, the dry pond is behind this with a beautiful water view. But many of these houses are really close to the street, as was the norm back in those days. Again, moving south, the Zebulon Waters house. This is where Deborah Sampson became Deborah Gannay, and this is where she petitioned Paul Revere for assistance. This is 1481 Bay Road in Sharon. Again, a nice barn here, beautiful house, sort of a garrison colonial. I've been in this house on a home tour when the current owners were renovating it, and it's very nice. Going across the street, and again a little further down, this is the Hezekiah Gay House on 1528 on Bay Road and on the Stoughton side, 1767. This is called the Popcorn House, and I think it's because they grew a lot of corn, maize that they learned from the Native Americans, and they would cook it, and it would pop, and so it in its earlier days, it always had a sort of an aroma of popcorn inside, so it became known as the Popcorn House. Certainly didn't look like this back in the 1700s. Didn't have the bay window. Certainly didn't have the portico here. Certainly didn't have the outbuildings, and this house also goes back quite a ways. If you look back on it, but if you can just imagine, the original construction of the house as it might have been in the 1700s. Here's the Ephraim Payson House. This is 1888 Bay Road. Again, very close to the street, built in 1761. There's a little sign here that denotes that. Very close to the street. You can see the curb right here, the white line showing the curb. So the house is very close to the street. Here's the power lines. This house is also called the Lightning House because in one of its renovations, it was they were remodeling the house, and they had some timbers behind the fireplace, and you could see the fireplace, the chimney here. So when they were renovating in this particular area, they found some charred timbers and the rest of the house didn't seem to be burnt down. So it's being attributed to the fact that this house may have been struck by lightning, so therefore referred to as the Lightning House. Okay, again, moving further south, now we've crossed 106 or Foundry Street, and now we're heading into Easton, and so we're looking at the oldest standing house in Easton, the Josiah Keith house, which was, this house was built in 1717. The oldest standing house, because there is some evidence that some houses may have been older but are no longer standing. So this is, to the Easton folks, this is kind of sacred ground. And it's also unusual in the sense that it probably, according to the Easton folks, this may have had a full second story, but over time, the second story was collapsed and removed. And so now it has this sort of unusual roof line because the house was in order to keep it and not tear it down, this is what the renovations looked like. This house is currently unoccupied. I took this photo when it was still occupied. Again, about a year or so ago, but it is currently for sale, or was for sale, before the winter. And the Easton folks were looking to put together some sort of effort to try to preserve it as part of the town. Okay, so this is the Josiah Keith Tavern. Well, maybe not. We all recognize this as sort of the mobile gas station at Five Corners. So, but this was the Josiah Keith Tavern back in the day. It's the gas station now, but this was a major intersection, and we know that it says Five Corners. It's Five Corners because it's Bay Road, it's 123 or Depot Street, and it's Foundry Street or 106. So if you can just imagine, here's an archival photo of the tavern, the Josiah Keith Tavern. I think this is pretty cool. So here's the tavern. This is Foundry Street. This is 106. So if you're going to bang a left here, you're going to go down Bay Road. If you're going to go straight, there's a fork here. So you're going to go on this part of the fork. You're going to go, 123 and then down Depot. And if you're going to continue this way, you're going on 106 towards Bridgewater. So this was the Josiah Keith Tavern. So back up a second. So here's our turning, right here, and we're going to take a left here and go on to, Bay Road that way. We're going to go straight, and if we went this way, we'd be on Foundry. So here we are, same thing. So we're taking a left onto Bay Road. So just a interesting archival photograph that shows that that Five Corners was really a center of commerce and how it's evolved over time. So still a pretty busy hub. Instead of a tavern, now we have a gas station and sort of a trading post, if you will, for different commodities. Okay, so moving further south on Bay Road, we have the second oldest house in Easton. This is the Benjamin Williams Tavern. And it's at 539. And again, we have a little marker here that denotes that. Many of these places were not only homes, but taverns at the same time. And right next to this is the Benjamin Williams barn. So the tavern had a barn. And this is the farmer's wife antique barn. So here's the barn. You'll drive by it many times. And then over here is the tavern itself. And here's their barn. So the barn is, kind of hanging in there. The day I went to take a photo of it, it was closed, so I couldn't get to go inside. But it still exists. It's still there. Okay, again, moving further south on 500 Bay Road, and now we're in the southern part of Easton. We have the Wheaton farm and the Wheaton barn, and this is the Wheaton barn here, and then this sign is right over here, and this is the part of Easton Conservation, and it's a massive area. There's public gardens here, and there's recreation areas. So this is pretty interesting. So across the street from this barn, and this field is where militia trained. So in 1775, after the Lexington alarm, the militia were mustered and actually practiced their drill and ceremony on the fields at Wheaton Farm. And then they moved north and they hung out at May's Tavern. They rallied there, and then they moved on their way into Lexington and Concord, and hooked up with George Washington in Canton, in Cambridge, and continued the fight. Across the street from the Wheaton barn is the Wheaton home. And so this is at 519. And so Daniel Wheaton was the original owner of this property. And it's a beautiful Federalist building. And this was for sale when I went by it, again, within the past year. So it's a fascinating story. So Daniel Wheaton was the brother of the Wheaton that founded Wheaton College in Norton. So even though they had a house in Easton, they were the founders of Wheaton College. And there's the stories abound about this place. Including ghost stories, which I was particularly interested in, as was my wife. So there's plenty of anecdotal stories that will say that a 19th century woman, and wearing clothing from the 19th century, was seen walking across the street between the home and the barn, carrying a lantern. And they also say that this same woman wearing a 19th century dress was seen in this window, and upstairs in that window, and then disappears. And people in this house have also said that just randomly they will hear someone whistling Yankee Doodle Dandy. Again, good story, very interesting story, but no first person evidence other than anecdotal evidence. But it makes for good presentations. Okay, again, moving further south on Easton, this is Kimball's General Store. Again, here's your original Targets or Walmart or even Ace Hardware. So here's probably Mr. Kimball, I would guess. And he's got all these barrels, and these barrels are probably have nails, and they probably have all sorts of things that you would want to be purchasing to keep your house going. And here's the same structure today. And so it's not hard to see if you look at it from this side, looking at it from the street, still going strong today. Okay, let's move down to Norton. So in Norton, there's this marker here. You could read it for yourself. This marker is the William Witherell House. It was built in 1669. And the house no longer exists, but there's a cemetery way behind here that behind this that is still in the process of getting cleaned up and renovated. And it was really overgrown and not even identifiable. So good job for the Norton people for making it cleaned up. But William Witherell built his first house here, and it made sense because it was a pioneer house. It was 20 yards. It's right across the street from Lake Winnicott. So we had water, we had fishy fowl. There was a sandy loam surface, earth, not difficult to work. The herring came up the Mill River. He had easy food and fertilizer. And William Witherell had 3 sons and a daughter. And in 1675, Sergeant Witherell fought and was wounded in the Great Narragansett swamp fight in King Philip's War. He was wounded. He spent 10 months recovering in South Kingston, Rhode Island, before returning home. The court of Plymouth made him a land grant of 15 pounds sterling. And on June 2nd, 1685, he was licensed to retail cider, beer, and strong liquors, and created the first public house in Norton. So crazy stuff. Again, moving a little further down, the Joseph White House is at 153 Bay Road in Norton, and that was built in 1725, as it says right here. So Joseph White was a third son of Nicholas White. Nicholas White lived in Milton, and he decided that Milton was too crowded, so he moved along Bay Road, all the way down into this Taunton area, and built his house. And he was an original shareholder of what was then called the Taunton North Purchase, which was east of Norton and most of Mansfield. And so that's the story of this house. But this house, unfortunately, has fallen into a fair amount of disrepair. When I gave this presentation in Norton, one of the gentlemen offered me some of these photographs, which I don't have a lot of history on because I asked him to present them. But in the interest of time, I'll just fly through some of these. But they go back into the late 18th century into the early 19th century. But the one I want to show you, which I found fascinating, was anybody remember Ann's place, which is now the Chateau? It's at 48 Bay Road in Norton, and it's adjacent to Lake Winnicott, and here it is here. And for those of you that are old timers, you probably remember it as Ann's place. And directly across from the Chateau, which was Ann's place, is that William Witherell marker and that cemetery. And so, you have Lake Winnicott right on the other side. So I'm just giving you that for two reasons. One, to give you kind of a frame of reference where the William Witherell house was. And for the second reason, to show you this, which is the original Ann's place. And so so this was given to me by a Roger Geffis, who was from Norton, and Ann was his aunt. And so pretty cool. So this was a filling station for motorized vehicles as well as for boats, and you could rent. Look at this, boats to let. So you could go out on Lake Winnicott. So that was the original Ann's place that eventually became a formal restaurant and is now the Chateau. So think about that next time you're driving by it or you're going in there for your chicken parmesan. Okay, how many folks remember Benjamin's Restaurant on 698? Now we're in Bay Street in Taunton. So we've crossed over 495 and we're in Bay Street in Taunton. And well, if I forget, remind me to mention about why has it become Bay Street versus Bay Road. So there's an interesting story to that. So Benjamin's Restaurant was in operation from 1968 to 2015. So what I've been there many times when it was open, and I never knew that there was a double tragedy there. There was both a fatal shooting and a suicide. I was completely unaware of that when I was there, and I wish I had known because I would have paid more attention when I was there. So George Poole, who was the owner of a silver company and a rival to the Reed and Barton Silver Company, he fell boarding a streetcar at Whittington Four Corners in 1905. He had a head injury and he suffered a change in his personality. And on the night of January 17th, 1907, 15 months after the accident, George came home from work in a drunken rage, finding out that his wife, Minnie, fearing for her life, was considering having him committed to Taunton State Hospital. George was infuriated. He attacked Minnie. Howard, the middle son, then 17, ran upstairs and retrieved his father's pistol from a dresser drawer. George had never owned a gun previously before his head injury, and the fact that he had a gun at all itself was quite alarming to his family. Howard, the 17-year-old son, pressed the gun to the left side of his father's head and said he would shoot him if he didn't release his mother. George didn't release his wife. He got shot by his son. He was transported to Morton Hospital where he died 3 hours later. Howard was taken into custody, but the jury refused to indict him and determined it was self-defense, and he was released. Howard's brother, Arthur, would go on to serve as mayor of Taunton during the Great Depression. And in his last year of office in 1939, Arthur's son, Arthur Poole Jr., committed suicide at the age of 14. Arthur Poole Jr. was Arthur's only son. So just a tragedy. And the building was demolished, and now there's housing that's there, and the housing looks like part of a monopoly board. They all look the same. It looks like a subdivision. It's just unfortunate. But you know, again, the history is something we should remember, and this is certainly memorable. Okay, some of the other things, moving back up Bay Road. So here we are back in Easton, and this is the corner of Easton and Rockland Street. I'm sorry, Bay Road and Rockland Street in Easton. And this was the original old Bay Road School in Easton. And here we could see a picture of that Bay Road School. And I call your attention to the fact that there's two entrances. And the reason is back in the day, you had one entrance for boys and one entrance for girls, because we didn't want any commingling of the genders, because you never know what might happen. And again, in that same vicinity, we have the old Bay Road Chapel, which is in the vicinity of 2601 Bay Road at Mountain. So the corner of Mountain and Bay, this is literally just the edge of Sharon and the beginning of Easton. We have the Bay Road Chapel. And again, you know, male and female entrances for the chapel. So this chapel was sort of a collaboration of a lot of the families. And just think of all these luminaries that were, you know, just regular folk back then. But now, you know, there are streets and buildings, and you know, they're named after them. So it was a functioning chapel in kind of an unusual part of the town, but it fell into disrepair, and now it's in the vicinity of this is a home that's used for young boys with special needs. Okay, again, going back down towards Taunton, some of the other buildings and churches. This is the North Taunton Baptist Church, built in 1837. It's on the National Register. It's across from the Taunton Cemetery. And in fact, at the Watson Pond State Park at the lake there, parishioners from the Baptist church here would get baptized in that lake. Okay, let's switch gears and go a little bit now towards some of the markers. So this is at 1805 Bay Road on the Sharon side, but I call your attention to the fact that if you're in the street looking towards the home at 1835, you'll see this S carved into this marker. And then if you walk around to the other side and you're on the house side looking towards the street, you'll see this other S carved into the marker. As best as we can ascertain, this was the early Sharon Stoughton border for those that wanted to know where was the town line. And of course, we know it's Bay Road. Again, moving south from here, here's a marker that says Taunton 13 miles, Boston 23 miles. And then it was built in 1773. And we see these marks here. This was thought to be of Richard Gridley, but it's really, as Richard Gridley was a surveyor of Bay Road and canon founder of Gavin's Pond, but it's actually Joseph Gilbert. And Joseph Gilbert, so this is more of a J than an R. So we're calling it Joseph Gilbert, and he was a tavern keeper. And tavern keepers really had to pay for the markers. And so if you're going to pay for a marker, damn it, I'm going to put my initials on it and not some guy that surveyed it. Joseph Gilbert was also a member of the Committee of Correspondence, which was sort of an analog to the Sons of Liberty, you know, in a real patriotic group. Again, moving south, 341 Bay Road. This is unique because this marker was originally at Five Corners at the Josiah Keith Tavern where the mobile station is. And it's unique because it's listed in half miles. So we see 9.5 miles to Taunton, 26.5 miles to Boston, 1773. And the Josiah Keith is scratched out. This was not the original Josiah Keith. This was a Josiah Keith descendant. His name was chiseled off because in 1803 he committed suicide, and mental health was not appreciated as considerate as we do today, and so he was not given a proper burial, and he was buried north-south instead of east-west in the cemetery. And the half miles is because this was moved. This was originally at that Five Corners intersection, but then it was moved half a mile north at 341 Bay. Here's another one that that is the Matthew Hayward Tavern. The Matthew Hayward initials are buried below the ground. The 9 up here is chipped away or weathered away, but it's 9 miles to Taunton and 27 miles to Boston. And the noteworthy thing here is that Matthew Hayward had a slave named Anton who marched with the militia for the Lexington Alarm. And because of his honorable service, he was granted his freedom after the end of the Revolutionary War. Again, moving south, here we are at the Benjamin Williams House, which is we already discussed as the second oldest house in Easton after the Josiah Keith House. This is the Benjamin Williams House, and this is definitely a replica marker. It was confirmed by me, by more than one person. So it's 8 miles to Taunton and so many miles to Boston. The noteworthy thing here are a couple of things, is that it was hit by a car. And so they made up a replica and they tried to make it as weathered and as old as possible. And it looks pretty good, but it is a replica. They're all dated 1773, which is interesting to me because this is a date after Easton was fined by the Massachusetts colony and this was the widest part of Bay Road, and they kept it in poor condition. So they were fined not once, they were fined 3 times. And so they had to have it surveyed, straightened, and improved. And so all of these markers say 1773, which was the big road renovation era. And so that's when all the markers went in, or approximately around that same time, at least in Easton. Okay, now we go a little bit farther south to Taunton. This is in the vicinity of 1090 Bay Street in Taunton. And it says 1760. This is if you're familiar with it's just on, there's the Home Plate Grill and Sports Bar that used to be called the Gondola. So it's on if you are on the same side as the Home Plate Sports Bar, and a little bit north of it, there's a small side road there, and it's going into a development, home development, and you'll see this marker here. So keep your eyes out for it. And then we'll end this section with just a few commemorative markers. This one is right at the Highland Split, I like to call it. So the Bay Road and Highland Split. So this is historic Old Bay Road, and this is it's on Stoughton land. An Indian trail, 1,000 years, foot trail for early settlers, post riders routes, a stagecoach road to Taunton, Rhode Island, and Rhode Island from Boston Bay. 1,000 Minutemen marched its trail to Lexington Alarm on April 1975, and it was put there by the Stoughton Bicentennial Commission. So there you have it. There's another one on the eastern side, a little further south, an ancient Indian trail, the post road between Massachusetts Bay and Narragansett Bay. See, they're committing themselves. They're laying their money down. That's going to Rhode Island. The first highway in Easton, Old Bay Road Historic District. But we know better. We know that it's more than one destination. Okay, we're going to quickly move through a few cemeteries. This is the Dry Pond Cemetery. Again, right at the corner of Bay Road and Plain Street. And the noteworthy thing here is Lemuel Smith, soldier of the Revolution. He enlisted in the Revolutionary Army, or the Continental Army, at age 16. He participated in a bunch of campaigns in Rhode Island and New York. They were 9 months each. He helped with the fortifications of Dorchester Heights. He saw the British withdraw from Boston Harbor. He was captured in White Plains, New York. He spent a year as a POW. He and a comrade overpowered a guard and escaped. He walked all the way home from White Plains, New York to Bay Road with the clothes on his back, and lived out a life of agriculture and self-sustenance. And he's still here on Bay Road. Okay. Moving south from there, Old Bay Road Cemetery, 161 Bay Road in Easton. The cemetery goes back to 1772. The interesting story on this, it says here, in this hallowed ground lie 150 bodies of veterans of various wars, French and Indian Revolution, War of 1812, Civil and Mexican Wars. Exactly where the bodies are buried is unknown. So all you see here is this one marker and a few flags. So this cemetery started out as a cemetery for the poor. So it was really a pauper cemetery. It was sort of like a Potter's Hill. And then the town decided to bury their war dead. So why did they lose track of where all these bodies are buried? What the Easton people tell me is that they had a guy that was sort of like, liked to imbibe and was, becoming a burden on the town, and, got locked up too many times. And so to work off his debt to society, he was enlisted by the town to mow the lawns at the cemetery. And he had to mow them by hand at the time. So he says, well, it's going to be a lot easier for me to mow this field if I just take the headstones away. So he took all the headstones away, put them off to the side, mowed the field, and then he couldn't remember where the headstones were, had to go back. And so he just left them there. And so therefore there's no record of where any of these bodies are buried. So say the Easton historical people. Now, Easton is noted for its cemeteries. They have probably more cemeteries per capita than any small city or town in probably all of the Commonwealth. This one is the Captain Jedediah Wills graveyard, and it's just his family. And this one is the Keith graveyard. We talked about the Keith graveyard. They have several graveyards, but it's not this graveyard, but it's a similar one where the descendant of Josiah Keith is buried perpendicular. This is the Elijah Copeland graveyard, and this is just a family grave. This is, you drive down Bay Road and you see Beaver Brook Road. You look directly to your left and you'll see that these are just markers with a chain. So it's really just mom and dad and the kids. There's nobody else there, but it's an official cemetery, and it's on somebody's side yard. This is on somebody's private property. Here's the North Taunton Cemetery. This is by the North Taunton Baptist Church, and you probably have driven by this. This is just, if you're coming from the north and you go across 495 and you look to your left, you'll see this. Okay, pop quiz, what is this? So this is Lake Winnicunnet. Lake Winnicunnet is right there by the chateau, or formerly known as Ann's Place. And here's Watson State Park, and this is where you get baptized if you were a member of the Baptist church community. All right, I'm going to end with a couple of here and nows, or back then and nows. So this is 1910. So this is Whittington Four Corners. So you're on Bay Street, and you're looking, and if you proceed down Bay Street, you're going to end up in Taunton Green. So you can see the trolley tracks, and you can see the horse and buggies. Look at this. This indicates in 1910 that inside this little pharmacy, they had a telephone. So I call your attention to the roof line here, to the roof lines here, to the roof lines here, and to the curve of the street. So that's 1910. So fast forward to today, 2020. This is Bay Street. This is Britannica. Here's the same building. Here's the same roof line. Here's the same buildings that go all the way down here. It really hasn't changed much if you look at it. I just find that very curious and very interesting. Okay, so now turn around, do an about face, and go on the Bay Street Whittington. So now we're looking north. So now we're looking back up towards Norton and towards 495. So you're in the same spot, and now you're looking up Bay Street. Here's the trolley tracks. And, so look at the buildings here, look at the roof lines, the cornices, and we're looking up Bay Street into Whittington Four Corners. And we look at from 1910 to 110 years later, and here we have the Whittington House of Pizza. Right here, we have these same, we have a little dance studio, and we have the same buildings, and they're a little nicer blacktop here, but things have changed, but really they haven't changed a lot. Okay, I'll end here. Just want to acknowledge the people that have helped me on my historical journey of learning about Bay Road. Of course, I mentioned Shirley. We all know Dwight, Frank from Easton, and I did reach out to the Mashpee Wampanoag folks. I did reach out to the Massachusetts Archives and to the Massachusetts Archaeological Society, and they were very helpful in piecing it together. And I probably went over my time, but and I barely scratched the surface on some of the things that I've learned. I'll leave you with this quote that comes from Benjamin Franklin, that historians relate not so much what is done as what they would have believed. And that's sort of my imprimatur to say, well, I'm only reporting what other people have said. So I can't be held accountable to this as fact. And I'll leave you with a picture that's not far from my house. I'll turn it back to Josh, and I'll hang around for anyone that wants to chat.
We'll leave your screen up there for now. So I'm going to go to the chat and look for some of these questions. Some of them are about history of particular places. I did answer the question about where Cobb Tavern is, but right outside Cobb Corner. What number Bay Road in Easton is the Josiah Keith house? Or what's the cross street, I guess, if you don't know that.
Yeah. Yeah, let me, I think I can find that in my notes. So it's in the vicinity of, it's probably in the 500 to 600 Bay Road area. So Benjamin Williams Tavern is 539, and it's probably 2 houses up from that. So it'd probably be in the the 450 to 500 range of Bay Road.
Okay. And why is it called Bay Street in Taunton?
Okay, good. Thanks for reminding me of that. So I asked the Taunton people, and specifically I asked Bronson Michaud from the Old Colony History Museum, and nobody knows, and nobody can even remember when it got made into Bay Street. But in the early 1900s, Norton renumbered their streets, so we do know that. But the best answer that anyone is willing to attribute it to is that because Taunton is a city, Taunton is a formal municipality, and the rest of us live in little towns. So rural areas, their streets are called roads because you're in a little town. But if you are elevated to a city and a municipality, you get to be called a street.
Someone missed what you said about the gondola. Was that a restaurant, I believe?
So yeah, so the gondola was again back in the day. It was the same restaurant, so people may have remembered it as the gondola. It's now the Home Plate Sports Bar and Grill.
Okay, and I hear the food's really good there.
Yeah, my wife's favorite.
Okay, and why did Benjamin's close? Wow, how would we even know?
So Benjamin's closed because the family fell apart. So they could not get along. They tried to keep it going, and they just couldn't decide on how to split up the profits and the expenses, and so a lot of infighting. And so they just decided to shut it down, and they closed it. And then they tried to sell it. They didn't find enough of a buyer, so they just closed it and just tore it down and sold the land. Very sad.
Did you say that Benjamin Franklin had widened Bay Road in Easton to 40 feet, or was that somebody else?
Well, the Easton people will tell you that Benjamin Franklin in 1754 surveyed Bay Road, and was one of either he or one of his party, one of his subordinates, was the surveyor that widened Bay Road. Again, some of that might have a little urban myth part to it, but the Easton people are very proud of their history, and they're attributing Benjamin Franklin as their surveyor. Now, just as an aside, a lot of Benjamin Franklin as a postmaster, you might be traveling on all these post roads, and one of the things I picked up along the way is that why are post roads called that? It's because the mail was delivered, and of course Benjamin Franklin, being a very clever and inventor type guy, he configured sort of a contraption for his wagon wheel and it was like an early odometer. So many turns of the wagon wheel would equal so many miles. And so they would get to a particular town and they would plant a mile marker. And that's where, not necessarily on Bay Road, but that's where they would plant the marker. So if you're out in Sudbury or out in Wayland or you're out in Springfield, and you would see a mile marker, that was why on a post road, that's how they would mark that. And then you would pay postage based on how far that post had to travel.
Lots of comments about all of us taking our lives into our hands driving on Bay Road, especially in Stoughton and Easton, the windy parts of the road. I doubt you'll know the answer to this, but folks are always asking, will that ever be widened? Will it be, I don't know, speed bumps, whatever, to make it safer? Are you in the know of any of that kind of stuff?
No, I'm not, but I hope it doesn't. And Bay Road sort of was eclipsed by Route 138. So we know that Route 138 is a parallels Bay Road, and so because the Bay Road was established by the Wampanoags, following the grade of the terrain, and then because it was too meandering and too hilly and too windy, 138 came about, and 138 is straight as a laser beam. And a lot more industry moved to 138, and 138 became a toll road and became the New Kings Highway. And a lot of the towns were reluctant. In fact, Easton, because the Hockomock Swamp, 138 had, they didn't want to support that because they'd have to fill in the swamp. And so the Hockomock Swamp was impeding 138. So Easton's always been kind of a, falling behind on trying to keep up with everybody else, but they had to capitulate. And so 138. So if you're not happy with the way Bay Road meanders, we are. So just take 138 or something else.
It's more of a residential road than a cut through. Yes.
Yes.
So I think this has been great, Joe. I think we've had a lot of folks who live on Bay Road in the various towns that come through. So I want to thank you for your wonderful presentation, and thank you to the Stoughton Historical Society for sponsoring this with us. And we have lots more to come. As Dwight mentioned, the history of FC Phillips Company and the history of the fire department coming up this spring. And of course, we have the 2 genealogical programs with David Lambert. All this will be up in our calendar at the library, www.stoughton.org/library. If you have any other questions or requests for programming, you can email me at jolshin@ocln.org. So I'm Josh Olshin from the Stoughton Library, and thank you for joining us this evening. Have a good night, everybody.
Okay, thanks. Bye-bye.